Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm the host of this Halaqa, Ilyas-Al-Durkastani. Today we have with us the founder of the Usuli, Brother Samir Hussein. He has studied Islam since 2007, studying Nahwa, Sarf, Balagha, Shafi Fiqh, Shafi Usul, Kalam, and Hadith in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Now, since 2017, he teaches Islamic studies and Islamic history at an Islamic high school in Canada. Here we also have Jibran, who's a student of philosophy. In a student as is a student of Western and Islamic philosophy and has been studying the subjects for a number of years at the University of Los Angeles, California. This halaqa's topic will be about the state of Islamic education today, the problems and the solutions to those problems. Now, should we start with questions? The first question is, what is the state of modern Islamic education?
All right. Well, the thing is, hard to sum up the state of the modern Islamic education system is that it's been heavily influenced by, what was a project during the 1920s to the 1980s of trying to sort of naturalize our form of knowledge, right? Nowadays, it seems like there's a sort of secularization of the Islamic worldview. Like, for example, I was praying Fajr one day, right? And I noticed that one of the khatibs, he was talking about science, quantum mechanics in the Quran, right? And he was talking about how the Quran constantly affirms, quantum mechanics and how this is somehow, wonderful proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then other times, people have come to me and they're like, mashallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has, forbidden pork because it leads to disease and germs and things like that. And so one major problem that our ummah faces is that we've sort of secularized or naturalized our theory of knowledge. And second of all, we've also adapted a more passive means of knowledge. In the classical Islamic philosophical literature, knowledge wasn't just merely the passive reception of knowledge, right? That the enlightened philosophers like Locke had of this concept of tabula rasa, right? That human beings are sort of a blank slate and they themselves, are just passive recipients of knowledge they gain from the outside world. Knowledge in the Islamic world had more to do with the soul. Allah defines knowledge as the soul's arrival at meaning and the meaning's arrival at the soul. So he defines it like this. A meaning is sort of the thing's place over the grand scheme of things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, the system that he has created. And the thing is that for knowledge to become education, right, there had to be what was called adab, right? And that is the soul's journey towards moving into the place that he was designed to be in, his place in the grand scheme of things, right? So knowledge not only was something that you passively received, but it also required acknowledgement and affirmation in the body, right? There was a moral aspect to it as well, that you didn't really were educated on the topic unless it was something that affected your actions and your being, right? And this sort of knowledge is sort of very absent behind many Muslims when they think of what knowledge is. And I guess that ends my comment.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Mashallah, I agree with a lot of what Brother Jibran has said. Definitely, this whole passive reception of knowledge is a problem, or as I like to say it, or I like to describe it, a passive reception of information. And how I like to imagine it, and I'm not, it's not something that's mentioned as I'm about to mention it in classical sources, although it might be somewhere. You never know. You might look somewhere, you might find it. But information is different from knowledge. So we are passively absorbing information from the internet, from social media, even sometimes from school. We passively absorb information, regurgitate it on a test, and then we get a bachelor's degree, and then we're called educated people. But for me, information is very distinct from knowledge, in a sense that information is just disassociated, unstructured bytes of information, and knowledge is structured information that builds true understanding of reality and of reality. So that's first. So I really agree with that, mashallah. Second, the knowledge that knowledge should lead to, and the purpose of education overall is adab. I really agree with that as well. I think Dr. Attas mentions that in his book, The Metaphysics of, I can't remember the title. I just know that big word that begins with a P. I try not to say it out loud because
the prolegomena of Islamic metaphysics.
Jazakallah khair, because I have no idea how to pronounce that word. Then also the moral aspect to knowledge. The knowledge is not just received, but there is amal to it. And of course, this is where our traditions of tasawwuf come in, and I think are very important in that aspect. Lastly, with regards to the secularization of knowledge, I politely disagree with my brother Jibran there. I don't think of that as secularization of knowledge. I see it as Islamic understandings and concepts being reframed in our time. And I'll give an example of that from the past. So if you've read some of my posts online, you might have guessed that I am one of the things. I mean, I don't say it a lot because my posts, I know it's Facebook and social media, so I regulate exactly what I post there. But one of my main focuses of research is kalam and Islamic theology, and especially how we can restate it or explain it in more contemporary or modern ways. Now, without changing, of course, the core theology that we have in the Quran and Sunnah in our traditions. But what was I going to say? But so the ulama of kalam, of theology, they did reframe and I guess you could even say re-understand Islamic theology in light of Greek metaphysics and Greek logic as well. And I think that's an important point because that shows us that in some ways the ulama recognized the need for that to happen, and not just in kalam, but also in usul al-fiqh and in tasawwuf as well. So I guess I'll leave it at that there. But as a whole, the problem of knowledge for me is a complex problem. I mean, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher for about, I think I'm getting close to my 10th year. I was teaching English before language. Now I'm teaching Islamic studies. So when I was in Saudi, I was actually working as an English teacher at university. And alhamdulillah, it was a pretty lax job, so I had a lot of time and funds to pursue an Islamic education on the side with teachers. So education, I think the problem with Islamic education is very complex and very vast in the sense that there's multiple problems to address. First of all, is public Islamic education is largely bad, as in the sense that most of it is driven by social media, online sources, people having to look up stuff, fatwa websites, etc. We don't have, or at least as minorities in the West, maybe in Muslim countries they have it, and I'm not sure about the quality of it. It depends from country to country, but we don't have a system by which everyone would learn some level of Islamic knowledge. So that's one problem by itself, public Islamic knowledge. Then, so in public education, then there's a problem of specialist education, Islamic studies, where we have problems of people either studying Islamic studies completely from a contemporary perspective, where they don't study traditional Islamic subjects at all. Then we have the other problem where we have people who only study traditional Islamic subjects, and sometimes in very confined and isolating environments, like with all due respect to the Darul Uloom system, there are some positive examples, but a lot of them, there is a strong culture of insulation from the outside world, and there are historical reasons for that. That's why kind of why the system was developed, but it does lead to people who have this sort of disconnect between traditional Islamic knowledge and contemporary. And I think the other part that's missing is that there is, so those two, you have people who have only the contemporary aspect and only the traditional aspect. Then if we did have a possible link between those two, that is still growing and not at the level where it should be. So for example, people who have a bit of both, by a bit I mean, like, you know, to a reasonable level, where they are to at least an intermediate level, where they're able to cross communicate between these two different, you could say, paradigms of thinking about Islam, or even like how to apply Islam to the real life. So the question is very broad, I felt. I've tried to answer it as best as I can. Yeah, that's all I can say without preparation.
Jazakallah khair for both of your answers. Since there seemed to be a slight disagreement, I was wondering if Jibran, if you would like to follow up with that.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, the thing is that the problem I have is that I wouldn't really argue that it's more reframing, because even the classical Muslim philosophers, they understood the role that science, for example, would play in the grand scheme of things, or how ethics, you know, how they were related to God. The problem I have is in the modern Muslim world, especially among the lay people, right? It seems to me that science is sort of primary and then the Quran is secondary, in which the Muslims seek validation through the Quran, through the sciences, right? That are usually done through, you know, what philosophers call methodological naturalism, which is this viewing of the world as if naturalism is true, right? So there's this sort of idea that when you're doing empirical sciences, the proper understanding is when you're making theories about the world, you can't invoke God or other creatures when you're doing scientific inquiry, right? You can't be like Newton did and said, you know, God periodically adjusts the orbits. That's not proper science anymore, right? And what I was just trying to say is that this sort of methodological naturalism, this methodology trying to understand the Quran and its role in it, has sort of become more dominant than it had before. And that in this methodological naturalism needs to go away, that I think is present in Islamic education.
MashaAllah, that's actually a very good point. And I sympathize with it a lot. I mean, I often say to people that I would love more than anything to just teach tafsir, hadith, you know, tasawwuf, fiqh, the classical subjects. But I can't find an audience for it because nobody knows how important that stuff is. Now, very important point, very good point, and I agree with it perfectly. I just feel that to get to that stage where we can actually discuss this stuff, people need sort of like a conceptual bridge, in that where they can get to the stage where they're able to appreciate the discussion on the other side.
Yeah, I understand, and that was something which is quite interesting in if we look in the philosophical tradition, right? They realized real early Christian philosophy. There's this movement called Reformed epistemology, right, which was this idea of introducing Christianity, right, not as a belief that is deduced from, you know, other things, right, from like the sciences or empirical observation, but making it more fundamental like that, by making it a belief as fundamental or a part of your worldview as your evidence base, your basic evidence base when you're making inquiries about the world. Because the thing is that if you look at, for example, how naturalist philosophers do, how they do their inquiry, they don't really bother proving their naturalism. They just assume it, and then they just work from it from there. And the thing is that, the Christian philosophers have also done the same thing, and they've been really successful with it. And I think, the Muslims can also follow in with that by bringing Islam back and putting it far more fundamental in our knowledge base, rather than making it something, secondary or something derived from some other source.
Yeah, so So again, I think we're on the same page. I actually try to do this with my... so I actually teach my grade 9 kids stuff that's pretty advanced for them. But alhamdulillah, they actually get it. I think sometimes we forget how intelligent we're in high school. I break my courses down into 3 units, the Islamic studies one at least. And what I do is when I start the theology unit, I'll take them through all these, rational arguments that Muslims have used in the past, scientific evidence you could use to corroborate that. Then the last section of that is actually it just completely changes pace, and it goes straight into tasawwuf. Right, how we can know God, know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can come closer to Him through basically tasawwuf, right? So the different pillars of ihsan, earning the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, karamatul awliya, ilham, kashf, all these things, right? So the whole point is I try to take them on that journey, basically. And I think, so far, I've done the course about 3 or 4 times, that unit. And it seems like it works. But of course, the thing with high school kids is you can't tell it worked until 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. Or that's education in general, right? Especially at the public level. Students either the education actually, the learning, the knowledge actually gets to them, or it doesn't. I mean, of course, many of us, I'm sure, remember very little about what we learned in high school and university. But I think public education works on a different level in the sense that it's not meant to teach you concepts in as much as it's meant to program your mind.
I agree. I agree. And there was something like when I remember when I was in Sunday school, they were talking about this question of, the objection they might give against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying, who caused God, right? Like, if everything has a cause, what caused God, right? And the textbook, my Islamic textbook, I kid you not, said, do not worry about this, right? It's just a doubt. Like, close your mind off of it. And that caused me a lot of problems. Like, what is this a serious question? Like, you guys don't have an answer to this? Right? And this to me was like, I understand it was for kids, but I can teach it, I can teach the argument to kids, saying that why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot have a cause, right?
Yeah.
And that was something, I think, I agree with you in that sense that, we should also not treat our kids as idiots, right? They're intelligent people, right? And thing is that when they go into university, how is it going to look like when we baby teach them in high school, and then when they reach into academic writings, they look at all these sophisticated arguments, and so there's this appearance of sophistication going on, and so
exactly
they might be more enamored by how sophisticated, how intelligent the atheist arguments are, and then looking at how they look back to their high school textbooks and look at how dumb, or not as academically rigorous the arguments were presented.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I have an moment in the sense that I think Junaid and me can talk for like hours. It's one of those conversations. I've had conversations with people that can last like well over like 5-6 hours. But so you'd be surprised. Like I'm actually facing right now. It's minimal, alhamdulillah. I actually face some opposition for this approach. There are actually people who are telling me that I need to make it nice and mellow and fluffy. And I mean, they're mostly, it's not parents. There are many parents have come to me actually appreciating this. It's actually other du'at, so to speak, okay? people who have like 1/10 of the minimal, not even 1/10, I'd say like 1/3 of the requirement to be able to speak about Islam authoritatively. And they will say things like, oh, you're not teaching them how to, come closer to the Quran. They can't, what's it called? Like, you're not monitoring their spirituality, which, to be honest, is a silly argument. I have them for one period a day. I can't really. Tarbiyah is the school's responsibility and the parents' responsibility. It's not, I don't think it's something, it is something that time to time comes up in the classroom, but it's not the primary objective in Islamic studies. But yeah, I agree with you completely. Like, and that's the understanding I had in mind when I first made the curriculum, was that I don't want these kids to go to university and think, wow, all that stuff I learned in high school about Islam was just fluff. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. I think the post that spurred me to be invited to this discussion was that when I quoted Islamic schools and how many problematic things I hear. So I think the latest one was, I was walking down the hall, and some of my female students in grade, I think it's 12, they started going to some, those auntie halaqas in the basement, and the lady said that drinking water out of wine glasses is haram because you're imitating the kuffar. And to be honest, as somebody who studied Shafi'i fiqh, and this issue is explained very well in some of the books, the issue of imitating disbelievers, whatever not, and how it can be divided into wajib, mustahab, mubah, makruh, and haram. Like, it's just that kind of stuff is like, when these kids think about it, they're just going to be like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. And they're like, is this really what Islam is? Like, we talk about drinking water out of wine glasses being haram. And kids, teenagers are, I think, apologies if any teenagers are here, but I like to call teenagers all biology and no brains. But it's a private teacher joke. But no, there's a reason for it. I think a lot of teenagers act impulsively. I mean, they're not at the stage really, especially the males. I think the males mature much later in life, especially when they start their careers, or late university, when they start their careers. That's when they really start to contemplate deeply about the world. Girls do it much earlier, it seems. Already by grade 9, 10, I get some really amazing questions from girls. Even the university level, I've done a talk or two at a university, and I get some amazing questions from the girls. But I do feel like there's a problem there. Like, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no worries. I understand you, and not only that, but there's also this loss of the purpose of knowledge, right? I mean, Ghazali himself says, the reason why mankind was created was so we could be Khalifa, right? And part of that is also to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by knowing ourselves. That's the first step, right?
Hey, so Jibran, just a quick warning that, like, just so we're on time, just after this statement, could we go to the next question? Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no worries.
I have to leave actually at 7:40, so yeah, just letting you guys know. Sorry.
All right, no worries. But yeah, I was just gonna say that, essentially, everything starts with why were we here and what is our purpose, right? And our purpose is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing ourselves, and that is what our knowledge is for. It's ultimately to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fulfilling our purpose in this world, why we were sent to the earth. And it is this central important message that is sort of lost in translation in modern Islamic education, I would say.
Yeah. No, I agree completely, yeah. Oh, so what he said there, I like to phrase that in a particular way, and Junaid can correct me if it's philosophically inaccurate or terrible, right? What I like to frame it as is whether we should phrase the crisis of youth in the West, or in general around the world now with the internet, right? Should we frame that as a crisis of identity or of ontology? Like, what's really the problem with the youth? Is it that their identity is a problem or their understanding of reality, right? So how I like to describe it, and I've been researching this stuff recently because I am okay. It's unknown to many people online, but I'm writing a book at the moment, and one of the discussions I have in the beginning is this whole problem of ontology versus identity. And identity essentially is a sociological term. There's a lot of it's basically, and it's an evolving term because if English is an evolving language, it's not static like classical Arabic, for example. So English, the word identity, as we understand it, it's often used a lot, but nobody really defines what it is. And there was a really good unpublished paper by a Stanford professor in philosophy. I can't remember his name right now, but I can share the link eventually, inshallah. But it explores what exactly the concept of identity is, and how do we define identity, and how the dictionary definition is not enough, because you need to really explore deeply what people mean when they use the word identity. And it all comes back to, in the end, this whole sort of projection from society back onto the self, right? That we're looking at society and then projecting back onto ourselves how we understand ourselves in light of society. Now that's not it's not a completely how do you say, what's the opposite of useful? Well, it's still a useful concept. Thank you. I'm sorry. It's late in the day. So it's not a completely useless concept, of course. It does come in handy in fiqh, for example. And to be honest, you still want people to reflect about who they are in society. That's part of that's usually how we define who we are for most people. But in the end, I do think the problem of youth today is not that. That's not the core problem. The problem is from the it's not the outward to the inward. It's the inward to the outward, right? How they're using, what their ontological perspective is of reality, how they understand the most basic building blocks of reality, and exactly, this comes back to exactly what Junaid said, right? That they don't understand even that. All these things around us are affecting our ontological perspectives, right? Like, for example, just watching a movie, for example, right? That subconscious sort of, those subliminal messages hidden in there. Things like, the stuff you study in school, how it's loaded with philosophical assumptions. You never know the difference, like naturalism, for example, right? And all these things we sort of soak in, and it affects our perception of reality, and we don't see it. And this is for most people, except of course for the ones, mashallah, who take their time to actually, understand Islam and understand Islamic theology. And may Allah make it all easier for us. But so that basic understanding that life is not about this dunya, for example. Life is a test. Life is about a transaction between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That we do good deeds and we're rewarded for that, or we're punished if we don't. About obedience, for example, ta'ah. About dhikr, for example, and the fact that there is a sort of a parallel reality function at the same time, which is the ghaib. So all these things, and for me, this concept was really interesting on even a social level. When I was living in Saudi, for example, I was studying there, and even at Cairo less so, but Saudi especially, some people, you just talk to them, you're like, if you ever talk to them, you eventually stop asking this question. But if you ask somebody in Saudi, for example, and now of course I don't mean the young generation, but more like the older ones, right? If you ask somebody in Saudi Arabia, for example, does God exist? He'd be like, it's a stupid question. Of course he does, right? Because I feel like that ontology, especially of course, the other problematic understandings are different, but at the basic level, the ontology is intact. Like, people don't question that, and it's just, it's so firmly rooted right at the bottom of their thought process. And of course, they don't notice that there is another thought process possible because they haven't even experienced that. But for them, when they express that, it's so obvious. Just like if you went to university in the West, for example, and you talked about slavery, or let's say whatever LGBTQ stuff, you'd have this immediate sharp response that would be highly indicative of the root understanding of everything is there's something wrong there. So I feel like that's an important distinction that should be made, because otherwise what happens is we sort of preach this being a Muslim on the outside is the main concern. And I feel like that's why we have this sort of obsession with, like Muslim social causes, which I'm again, I'm not condemning these things absolutely, right? But you have things like obsessions with Muslim social causes. You have the obsession with hijab. Okay, as hijab is wajib. Okay, nothing's going to change that. It's ijma'. But at the same time, we have sort of politicization of hijab. We have extremes, and the true reasoning behind hijab, or forget that, the true reasoning behind iman and ihsan and Islam becomes lost to a lot of Muslim women. Like their entire sort of religiosity becomes defined by the concept of hijab, and it's
yeah. So basically, what you're trying to say is like people are focusing more on the symptoms of the problem instead of the problem itself.
Yes, it's a very efficient way of putting it than talking for 15-20 minutes.
Barakallahu fiqh, Jibran and Samir. Now to follow up with the next question, why is Islamic education in the state that it's in today?
So why is it in the condition that it is today? A lot of reasons. One of the reasons I'll mention some people might not like that. I don't know, of course, the audience, who they are and stuff. But so multiple reasons, of course. In the past, we had things like colonization, the spread of nationalism, secularism in the 18 and 1900s. 1800s, of course, that was during mostly on the Ottomans, European influence on them. And the 1900s for the rest of the Muslim world. Although, of course, you can say India and Egypt, some parts were earlier than that. But yeah, the colonization was a huge thing. And, they really tried, and I was, we all hear about it, but actually when I read into it a bit more, especially scholars in the time period, you're kind of surprised at how much of an effort the British and French made to like really uproot Islam from the culture and just like the most basic understandings that Muslims have, especially in Egypt, for example. Like the British were tried to influence Azhar a lot. So things like that. Colonization would be the first one. Another one would be things like, I guess, like the Enlightenment, modernity, and stuff like that. It was like a blinding flash. Even the West, not just amongst Muslims, but I feel like these things happened so fast. Technology progressed so fast. Scientific knowledge progressed so fast that people were blinded by it. They didn't know how to make sense of it, and that's why perhaps positivism was such a big thing in the early 1900s, because World War I, people feel these effects from so the sudden surge of technology in warfare and the supremacy of technology, etc. Right, and even continuing into the postmodern period as well, there's still this sort of like dazzle of modernity. Like people are still confounded by how much they perceive humanity has quote unquote progressed. So that's colonization, this, and lastly, people might disagree with this, but I do feel like and then before I get to this one, another one would be, and so that link to that modernity whole thing is the issue of Muhammad Abdul, right, and Jalaluddin Afghani, and the rhetoric they started of basically saying that Islamic knowledge was in decline after the 1700s around, right, and that people were just regurgitating the same thing over and over again. And I think there's been I know of 3 books that have been published recently in the past decade or so, addressing the concept. One is by Khalid al-Ruwayhib, one is by Ahmed Dalal, and the last one I keep forgetting the author's name. But basically, in different ways, they try to express how this is an incorrect notion. But this was started in the 1920s by figures like Muhammad Abdul, etc. Now, and that train of thought is still very common in Azhar and that community, and everyone who's influenced by that, like the Maqasidi movement as well. Although of course I'm not saying these things are invalid concerns, that tradition should move forward, that we should be using Maqasid Sharia in some ways to move our fiqh forward. But again, there's a sort of like ideological movement in that direction. Then lastly, I feel like and this might be my bias because I studied in Saudi, I do feel like the Najdi movement has done a real bit of damage to how we study and understand Islam. And I don't have anything against someone having those views, to be honest, even though I disagree with them. What I do find really problematic is the corruption of pedagogy in those circles, and especially, and it wasn't as much, and it was kind of rooted in their understanding of aqidah and theology, in the sense that they didn't want to follow the traditional patterns of study because they were seen to be biased towards the opposing understanding. And and also there might be a political element in it too, in the sense that when I was in Saudi, it seemed kind of like it's something mentioned among students. Of course, we're not sure, like we haven't seen explicit statements about this stuff, but it seems like the government uses this ideology as a means to silence scholars or for them to prove their allegiance to the state. Because you have to remember, like, Najdi theology is not just theology for them, it's also like their constitution, their means of legitimacy as a country. I mean, it's called Saudi Arabia. Why? And Arabia is full of different tribes and stuff, especially the Sharifs, for example. The Sharifs, the Ahl Bayt over there. So if you're talking about who most deserves to be the ruler of Arabia, somebody can easily say the Sharifs, or somebody can say this other tribe, right? And then you can have complete civil war, as Arabia has always been before Islam. And of course, sometimes even recently. So, all these four factors combined, I guess you could say, I think all these have significantly affected. And then the last one actually should be social media and the internet and this whole celebrity culture, especially in the West, where knowledge is not institutionalized, which has its drawbacks and its pros. But yeah, so five different reasons I would put why this issue has become a problem. And I guess you can mention a sixth as well. Sorry. When it comes to public education, it's still relatively a new thing. And I guess we kind of have to reimagine how we would teach the public Islam while not expecting them to become experts. So I think that's another challenge as well. Like this whole concept of public education, introducing this in society, and how we're going to sort of bureaucratically implement that as well. Allahu Akbar.
Jazakallah khair, brother. The next question is Islamic education better in certain parts of the Muslim world? If yes, what are those regions doing right that every other country is failing at?
So Islamic education, who's getting it right? I really like where Turkey is going with this. And there's actually one institution, Ibn Khaldun University in Turkey, which what they do is if you're doing a master's program or whatever, you'll do your courses in philosophy and social sciences and different contemporary sort of subjects, epistemology, whatever. From a contemporary perspective, you study all those things at the university. Then in the evening, you have the option of, and you have a joint program where you study traditional sciences with scholars in the masjid. Traditional studies, sometimes really intensive ones. And again, there's a lot of scholars in Turkey right now because of the whole Syrian crisis. So a lot of scholars have moved into Turkey, different parts of Turkey, Istanbul, whatever not. And of course the east, which is where most of the Syrians are probably. But I feel like Turkey's really getting it right in the sense that they've combined these two approaches. But one thing they're missing, and I think is important, is the natural sciences as well. I think it's still important to have that perspective, because you sort of, it's a form of grounding for understanding philosophy. At least that's what I feel. And Jibran can comment on that.
Yeah. Modern analytic philosophy, which is the predominant school in philosophy, does put heavy emphasis on the sciences. And so anybody, like if you were to open any book on the philosophy of mind or philosophy of time, you better have some background, a decent background in either the cognitive sciences or in physics. Nowadays, philosophy is less about armchair philosophy where you're sort of sitting back and speculating. Now it's more concrete, more grounded. When you write Like, for example, in the modern metaphysical techniques nowadays focuses more on language and rooting down language and understanding how language relates to the reality. How do words that we say refer to objects in reality?
Are you referring to structuralism?
Oh, no, this is analytic philosophy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Generally, that's what modern philosophy has sort of come down to, and that's why one of the problems I have with modern ulama is that they're sort of just in their own little circle. Because I remember one time I talked to a student who was studying Kalam, right, and I talked to him about existentialism, by Sergeant Baudrillard and how that affects transgenderism and all of that. And he basically went to me and said, "Oh, the Muslim philosophers in the 12th century." He gave me some name. He figured it all out. We already refuted existentialism before he even presented it. I'm like, no, what? How? This isn't. There's this idea I've known that these traditions have sort of figured everything out, rehashing when in reality, you're right. A lot of ideas, old ideas, but they're giving new twists to it. And the thing is that we have to address those new twists.
That's true. Yeah. I agree with that 100%.
The problem I have is, right, we need a sort of synergistic view of education. We need to not only be educated on our traditional sciences, but we also need to, knowledge about what modern academic field is talking about, right? What does science say, right? And how does that relate to, a more coherent understanding of the more synergistic view? Because the problem is that I know it's more demanding, but modern philosophical problems are less based upon speculation now than they were before. They require more of a background in, for example, linguistics, or in physics, or cognitive sciences. And so I think the modern mutakallim now probably has to do more work than probably ever in Islamic history.
For sure.
And unfortunately, there's less interest in that science than any other science when we need it the most.
For sure. Yeah, I agree 100%. In fact, the problem is still there's a lot of Eastern people who are considered experts in Kalam, and they're still arguing things using the whole holomorphic technique of the Greeks, and it's really annoying because I'm not saying it's completely. Somebody like Wolfgang Smith made a case for it, but it's just. I think we need to move past that for and really look at how we can replace that Greek metaphysical element. I understand why it's there and why it's lingered, because only with contemporary science and these theories of language, etc., have we really begun to understand how old and ancient that was, right? And that really needs to improve. Yeah. And you were mentioning, how that's difficult, but I think that's an important point, and that's why I keep most of my public posts are on the topic of education, right? Because I can't even begin to speak with people unless I first see them learning, or I see them, taking an interest in studying Islam, because this whole issue is. I'll give you an example. The Ottoman Empire, their curriculum, the full curriculum, was 20 years long, right? And in fact, the people who did the full curriculum, they would actually go on to occupy positions in government. Of course, that changed in later Ottoman Empire, when the only requirement was to go study a foreign language. It's interesting when you analyze that history, how the concept of diplomacy and its importance in the modern world, or the pre-modern industrial world, became something of priority, and the only thing you needed to occupy a government position at one point was literally learning a foreign language, nothing else. If you went abroad, learned German, came back, now you get a government position, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But so that was a serious problem. But in the first half of Ottoman history, there was this whole, people were expected, the wazir and the grand wazir and the lower ministers, they would usually have this 20-year-long education. People who completed only part of the program, like 5 years, for example, these people would go on to become like masjid imams. And the people who could complete the entire program, they would go on to become major scholars, lecturers or teacher, leaders of seminaries, etc. And the curriculum itself is very interesting in the sense that they were studying everything. So even, and this is the case in Azhar as well, right? They were studying everything. They were studying traditional sciences. They were studying calligraphy. They were studying mathematics. They were studying philosophy. They were studying medicine. Even I think they were studying sometimes like architecture. But all these things, like they made a certain mindset, right? And I'm not an expert in Ottoman history, so I once how I know my Ottoman history is that I once sent an email to Dr. Yaqub Ahmed, who is this professor of Ottoman history in Istanbul, and I said, I don't know nothing about Ottoman history. Can you refer me to some sources I can use? And he sent me a list of like 30 books. I read 2, and I'm like, that's enough for me. Sorry, 3. I read 2 or 3. I'm like, that's enough for me. I can't. I can't become an expert in topic. I dedicate too much time and energy to it. But even from that, like the books I was reading, they're really good ones. I can recommend them. They both have Ottoman history in their titles. One is by Halil Incharik. The other is by Donald Quatert. I don't know how you say his last name that well. But I can post the links, inshallah, if anybody's interested. But what these books do really well, especially Halil Incharik's one, is that he uses primary sources. He goes to actual like documents, for example, like trade documents, government documentation, the old Ottoman Turkish, and he'll basically present that information to show exactly what happened in history. And when he has this whole chapter on the education system, and it's very interesting to see how that broke down. The same thing, we're talking about. I was talking about earlier about Duat not studying properly, and then talking about public issues. This actually started then. And this whole like sort of anti-scholar populism, which in some way is like I know that scholars have an ego problem, to be honest. I've seen it myself, and like you said, like the person they claim that this philosopher in the 12th century that answered every single question. So there is that problem too. So in some ways it's kind of justified, but at the same time it's also a problem because then people think that attaining a high level of knowledge is not important to being a good Muslim or not important to solving the problems of the Ummah. So, mashallah, jazakallah khair, this is a very good discussion and a very important one, that needs to be talked about more often.
Thank you. May Allah bless you both. Now we are opening up the questions to the audience. So if there's any questions you all have, you could type them in discussion voice chat and I will ask the questions for you, inshallah. Okay, there's a question. Can you ask what students should do regarding getting a more solid grounding in physics, linguistics, etc. when it comes to studying philosophy, especially for those who aren't in university yet?
Oh boy, for that one, like self-learning physics. Well, first you would have to know the necessary math, so you would have to know calculus at least, right? And then even then, you would have to understand the concept in physics. The Feynman lectures are really good introduction, I believe, to quantum mechanics. For linguistics, to understand the analysis of language, I would just first, I would recommend just first thing, understand the language, understand grammar first, like what's a noun, what's a verb, and then understand, conjugation, like verbs and things like that, because they play a very key role later on in philosophy. Like, for example, if you get into the philosophy of time, the existence of tense facts is going to be very controversial. And, there's a huge debate on whether or not tense sentences, like it is now 7 o'clock, can they be translated tenselessly? Like it is 7 o'clock at 7 o'clock or 7 o'clock at the moment of this utterance, things like that. So you would first want to just understand the basic concepts and fundamentals before you would want to get into the more advanced discussions in philosophy. But that's only if you're going to major in philosophy, not if you just want to. This might be a bit excessive to somebody who may not want to be an academic philosopher. But if you want to get into an academic program, having a solid understanding of physics and linguistics is going to prepare you really well for upper division work.
Okay, the next question is, what topics should Islamic education be focused on today to reestablish the classical standards?
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, first of all, so look, the objective in Islamic studies period is obviously where we get our knowledge from, is the Quran and Sunnah. Now, to get to the Quran and Sunnah, there's a number of steps to take. And, people say, oh, why all these steps? And I'll explain that in a second. But so what you need to do is, you need to first of all study the Arabic sciences very well. My teachers always told me this, and I found it to be very true and very accurate. They said that whoever does not master the Arabic language first will never amount to anything in Islamic studies. And, it's very true, and I only realized it, much further, and when I met other people, etc. Right? I mean, like, some things that are so obvious to me from, like, Arabic linguistics and, linguistic analysis in the Arabic language, some people just don't see it at all, and they think I'm speaking in, like, tongues or philosophy or whatever, and I'm not. I'm just explaining a basic grammar point. But, like, so first is the Arabic language, and that's, that takes quite a bit of time. Even if you're an Arab, you have to learn, like, Nahu, Sarf, Balagha especially, right? Nahu is like, you consider Nahu and Sarf a preparation for studying Balagha, and Balagha a preparation for studying Arabic literature. And of course, we're not, most of us, I'm sure, have not grown up in scholarly backgrounds. I didn't either. Not even a religious background. And, there's only so far you can take it. Time is limited, life is short, many other things going on. So you do as much as you can, but there is a certain standard, right, that we should aspire to. And it's not necessarily always the amount of books you study, the amount of mashayikh you study with. It's acquiring that capability in the language. And then that's the first part. Then there is studying fiqh, right? Fiqh, people don't understand that a lot of our books in tafsir and explanations of hadith, for example, these are written by people who are following the madhab, right? So to have greater access to those books, understand them better, you need to really study a madhab. And everything in Islamic studies became, sort of conjoined with the madhab, right? Study of hadith, the study of usul, the study of arguably very contentiously even maybe kalam, became sort of conjoined with these four schools. So when you don't study that fiqh, especially from one of those four schools, can be any of them, you end up in problematic territory because you're missing a key sort of puzzle piece that ties everything together. So, and also, of course, fiqh shows you how the ulama actually implemented usul. And that's probably the most important part, right? People just study usul al-fiqh maybe, and then they won't actually know how scholars used it. So that's so fiqh, and then usul as well. Like usul al-fiqh is another one, the sciences of hadith, and then you move on to studying tafsir and the actual hadith books as well. So that's the preparatory process. That's just base. That's like the minimum an Islamic studies program should do, right? The minimum. Then going beyond that, I had once a post on that public page I have, where I said that we need a new quadrivium, which is like Islamic studies, the stuff I just described, contemporary philosophy, science, and what was the last one? The social sciences. Okay, so stuff like history, political science, etc. This is what a true contemporary Islamic education, like a level of, you're not just, and I'm not saying this, I don't look down on the ulama who studied only traditional sciences, as long as they know that this is their specialty and they stick to it, right? I have immense respect for ulama who've spent 20 years going through like Arabic grammar or usul al-fiqh or mustalah hadith, and these are our ulama, and they have a status in society and a status in the akhirah, inshallah. But at the same time, we do need people who are traversing boundaries and have, their feet in different places if they have 4 feet.
Because of time, we only have one more question. Should we try to return to the past way of Islamic education, or should we create something new that works for today and the past?
So both, right? I think Jibran has been saying kind of the same thing as well, right? Sorry, I'm speaking for you.
Yeah, of course, you're right. It's both, because the thing is that there are a lot of things in Islamic theology and philosophy, really, in Islamic philosophy, that didn't really doesn't translate in the modern day very well. Like, our method of doing metaphysics is largely outdated and wouldn't seriously be taken by any major Western academic journal, right? Like, for example, it used to be in time of Aristotle, they thought that the fundamental components of everything was matter. Now, physics has shown it's actually energy. Some have even argued information. That's the fundamental building blocks. But the point is that we're in a modern day and we have modern problems, and those need solutions. Like, I'll give you another example. In the 1960s, there was a guy called Gettier, and he had this thing called the Gettier problem. This destroyed the classical understanding of knowledge that Western philosophy is trying to fix itself back up. We don't even have a universal understanding of knowledge anymore. And the thing is that while Western philosophers trying to figure out this problem, the Muslims have sort of just been ignored. Nobody's really working on this problem. And that's very fundamental for us, because knowledge is something very important. When we make claims about knowledge, right, like, I bear witness that there's no God but Allah, what does that mean? These are modern issues that somebody needs to work on. But likewise, just because we change our method doesn't mean we should change our fundamentals, right? We need to find that balanced golden mean.
Yeah. So so the old stuff is still important, because remember, when we talk about Islamic studies today and how it needs to improve and change, we should be continuing what came before, not starting a new chapter completely. Like blank slate. Here we go. Because you're restructuring things that don't need to be done. You know what I'm saying? Sorry, not restructuring, but you're starting a new structure that's you're going back to the time of the Salaf, and these understandings have been building since then. But you're saying, okay, forget all that, blank slate, let's start again. And that's when you get actually problems, right? Not just super conservatism, but this whole modernist outlook on Islam as well, right? People don't realize how those two are very linked, by the way. As a whole, though, so the point of knowledge was very important, right? I mean, these philosophies, like the Gettier problem, I don't know what that is, to be honest, but things like these philosophical questions, we might think these are confined to like philosophy departments in universities, but these things percolate down into society, right? They affect society. I was just watching recently, I was listening to a talk about postmodern art and postmodern movies, for example. And, we consume that media, and, subconsciously it affects us, right? It affects, I'll give you an interesting example. So I'll say two things. One is this example, and then I'll finish off with why Islam needs to be updated, right? The fiqh needs to be updated to the modern era, as Jibran said. So one is this, for example, like Doctor Strange, right? When the whole scene with Dormammu, I've come to bargain, whatever. So Dormammu, at least how they portrayed it, as I feel, was supposed to be like the supreme being in his dimension, okay? Sort of like the god of his dimension. But at the same time, he was shown to be just one being in a multiverse. So he's not even supreme in the first place, because he's only the deity of his domain. Then, on top of that, Doctor Strange is able to outsmart him with a time machine or whatever, right? But the whole point is, of course, if you're consuming your media critically, you'll think about that. But if you're not, then that kind of, affects your understanding of omnipotence, right? And whether there can be such a thing as an omnipotent being, what that would conceptually what that would be like, etc. And perhaps Allahu alam, Allah knows best whether these things are affecting. And of course, besides shahwat and these kind of things, right? For the average Muslim, like, do these things affect the way we think? So that's the first thing I want to say. And lastly, I gotta go, so I'll finish off with this. So some people think when we're talking about Islam coming to terms with the modern world, they think we're being modernist, and I think that modernist label, wallahi, like it's so problematic. Like a lot of people use it without knowing what it is, and people are like, oh, Islam and modernism. First of all, they usually don't know what they're talking when they say the word Islam, because again, they're not well versed in tradition, right? How did scholars understand what Islam is? Then, the other aspect, which is the contemporary stuff, right? So I'll give you a really obvious example that'll be obvious to everyone, okay? And be careful with how you use this, okay? So I'm telling this to you, but again, it's in like, you'll find it in every single madhab's beginner primer in fiqh, okay? So it's not just like, it's not an advanced issue, so to speak. If you're going to study a basic fiqh primer, you will come across this. So when they talk about hayd, the chapter of menstruation, all the four madhabs have this, by the way. They'll talk about the minimum possible, so when it comes to pregnancy, they'll talk about the minimum possible limit for pregnancy, the maximum, and the average. Okay, so the average is obviously often gives 9 months, minimum 6 months. Like obviously we're talking about a pregnancy that actually results in a live birth. And then the maximum term, interestingly, goes into years. So the Shafi'i school, for example, 3 years, and I've heard the Maliki schools like 4 or something. And I really meant to ask a gynecologist about this, especially like someone who does research and stuff and really knows their stuff, of course. And I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I don't think that's possible. And the ulama, when they came to that conclusion, they were just reading into whatever they saw in society, right? There was no they didn't do like a statistical analysis or an epidemiological study, for example, right? They didn't do anything like that. They just, they heard of a case where a woman said she was pregnant for 3 years, and they concluded that that's the maximum limit. Now, obviously, for most people, they'll be like, what? And when then people say, oh, we should go back to tradition and abandon any sign of modernity or being affected by modernity, like, okay, so do you just want us to go back to these things? You know what I'm saying? Or should we question them? Or should we try to improve them or update them? And I think we should. And, I see precedent for that in even any tradition, any part of our tradition. The fiqh tradition, for example, has been, especially the Shafi'i school, it's easier to tell because there are distinct stages in the formation of the madhab. And you can actually see scholars, adjusting things as they went by. Of course, some principles stay in place, but scholars adjusted things as they went by because they realized over centuries, whether consciously or unconsciously, that they need to adjust the fiqh for their surroundings and the different times and different spaces, right? And it's very, so I think people need to be careful when they throw around that whole Islam versus modernity, modernism, tradition, and people don't understand these are loaded terms, and we don't define them before using them.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah bless you both for your constant efforts of searching for knowledge and spreading them. If you all look in discussion voice chat, there is Samir Hussein's website, theusuli.com, also the Usuli on Facebook, and Jibran's Twitter. Thank you so much, and the Halaqa is finished.